Hey everyone, I know you think I must be insane for playing the Super Nintendo version of Final Fight, but I have my reasons for that, as I will get to as we watch the initial introduction here, setting up the plot of the game. The Mad Gear Gang has taken control of Metro City, and Mayor Mike Hager is basically the only person standing between them in total control. As you can see, they've kidnapped his daughter, and that doesn't make him very happy. If you were to play the Sega Genesis version of this game, you would actually get a spoken narration by the characters. So in the Super Nintendo version, we only have two characters to pick from, Cody and Hager. I'm gonna go ahead and pick Cody. Cody, who has since graduated to the Street Fighter series. If you're not familiar, Final Fight is a side-scrolling beat-em-up game in the same genre as Streets of Rage. This game came out early in the Super NES's life cycle, so it had to make some sacrifices because the programmers didn't quite know what the hell they were doing yet. And in order to prevent the game from slowing down, flickering too much, and just being a total shit show, they made it so that you could only play as Sorry, I lost my train of thought there, kicking butt. They basically made it so that you couldn't play two players at the same time, and for cartridge space limitations, you can only play as two characters instead of three. The arcade version of the game had Cody, Hager, and Guy, whereas the Super Nintendo version only had Cody and Hager. They did, a year or two after the game was originally released, come out with a Blockbuster Video exclusive version that replaced Cody with Guy, called Final Fight Guy. Copies of that go for quite a lot of money. Copies of this version do not. Now, one thing I want to say right off the bat is even though this game does not support two players, I feel it's a pretty good port of the arcade game. The characters are large, the animation is pretty solid, the on-screen details such as the life bars and things like that look very similar. I think they did a good job of porting the game given their limitations, especially with regards to the cartridge size and their knowledge of the hardware at the time. I think, however, their misstep was not trying to make a later version of the game that, improved on this. They did eventually release a sequel, Final Fight 2, which, yes, is a better game, but kind of had some steps back in a way. And I often felt that this game was so popular in the arcade and so beloved by people that they could have released, a Final Fight Deluxe or a Final Fight Arcade Edition, put in the two-player mode, put in the extra character, put in the missing level, because this is missing one or two stages. I think one stage, and then another one's shortened. They could have done that, and people would have bought the game all over again. They did that for the Game Boy Advance version, which came out some years later, of course. And the Sega Genesis version, the Sega CD version, was a masterful port at the time, which put everything back in as it should be. I also find it amusing that Sega wanted this game for the Sega Genesis some 3 or 4 years after this game was popular and kind of had already been run its course. As I throw Sid here, The interesting thing is Roxy and Poison, the female characters, were changed in the US version of the game to Sid, and the name of the other character escapes me, but when we see the green-haired dude with the high top hair, that's the other Roxy and Poison replacement, and they replaced them because they didn't want people beating up girls in a Super Nintendo game. Which is ironic because for a long time, it was known that Poison, at least, was a crossdresser and not actually female. But I think that's since been retconned. I can't remember. Capcom changes their minds so often. Also, Thrasher there, who I just beat in the arcade game, his name was Damned. And you know that wasn't going to make it through to a Super Nintendo game. The reason why I'm playing the Super Nintendo version of this game is it's one of the first Super Nintendo games I ever owned. When I think of the Super Nintendo, I think of games like Super Mario World, F-Zero, and this, because those were my earliest introductions to the system. So I played the heck out of this game. If I recall correctly, it came out around the same time as Streets of Rage, but I didn't own a Genesis until a few months after that. I got the Super Nintendo first, actually, and then I got a Sega Genesis probably 3 to 6 months after? That part's foggy for me. Another thing I'd like to point out real quick is that the number of enemies that can appear on screen at once is limited to, I believe, 3 or 4. Again, they didn't really know the full power of the Super Nintendo's chip. They were being conservative. If they had made this game even a year later, they probably would have been able to fit more characters on screen, or at least make it so you could play 2 players. I'd make a complaint about the hitboxes and the damage detection, but honestly, it was just like that in the arcade version of the game. This is a game where you definitely need to know where to stand, when to stand there, and kind of have a game plan. But once you figure out the little idiosyncrasies of the game, yeah, it's not too bad. You can get pretty far. There are also continues and everything, so no biggie. As we're riding the subway here, I always love this stage. Of course, it's better in the arcade, the Sega CD, and the Game Boy Advance versions because you can see the handrails at the top moving and things like that, but this is still pretty cool. As I was saying, though, this is one of the games that, when I think of the Super Nintendo, this game pops into my head. And I think it's important to know that this game sold probably a million copies, based on the fact that it was a decent port of the arcade game, even though it was lacking the 2-player mode and other details. Unfortunately, there was no other port of Final Fight for 2 or 3 more years. And people weren't very familiar with the Streets of Rage series yet. So this was kind of it. If you wanted to beat 'em up, this was the game you got. There are definitely better beat 'em ups even on the Super Nintendo. Of course, Final Fight 2 and Final Fight 3 eventually came out. Ah, Billy, that's the other Roxy and Poison replacement. Jalico had a number of really awesome beat-em-up games. They weren't perfect, but on the whole, they were pretty darn good. Peacekeepers was one of them. I think Rival Turf was the first one. I must admit, the beat-em-up genre kind of blurs together in my head. After Final Fight and Streets of Rage kind of set the table for everything, companies were off to the races trying to capitalize on it. Much in the same way that, Street Fighter II spawned the fighting game genre. I mean, I guess it wasn't the original fighting game, but it was the one that made companies realize they could make money on that sort of thing. These days, I would say if you want to play Final Fight, just get one of the recent beat 'em up collections that Capcom has released that includes it. You can play the arcade version, you can continue as much as you want, you can make the graphics look authentic or sharp, all those sorts of things. If you're trying to go old school and you don't want to do the Game Boy Advance version, then the Sega CD version is the must-play. Still, I think Capcom did a good job with what they had and the time that they did it. Also, comparing this game to Streets of Rage, while Streets of Rage does have a two-player mode and has more intricate gameplay, I think Streets of Rage, because its graphics aren't quite as large, like the characters aren't quite as large, and the detail isn't quite the same in spots, I think there's an argument there for the merits of this game compared to Streets of Rage, and I do think, in hindsight, Streets of Rage is the better game, but I don't think it's the huge divide that it could have been. I think both games are worth playing on their own merits. That said, when Streets of Rage 2 came along, there was no reason to play this game again. This game has a certain style to it, which is nice, especially when you consider the original arcade game came out in like '89. But Streets of Rage 2, that reset everything for the fighting, or the beat-em-up genre. And I've actually been putting off making a video about Streets of Rage 2 just because I want to be able to do that game justice. I want to play through it a few times to reacquaint myself with it. I do play it off and on, but in a very casual sense. I haven't tried playing through it to do well in at least 3 or 4 years. So that game for me is coming in the pipeline, but not soon. Once we beat these guys, we'll be heading to the next boss. And as we're in the ring here fighting against Katana, who in the arcade version of the game is called Sodom, which is the same character from the Street Fighter games. Although this is a much deadlier iteration of him, and the best way to beat him is to try and stay vertical of him, but it is not a guarantee, as you've noticed there. This guy was always a bugger in the arcade, but it also makes sense. In the arcade, they want you to put in quarters to pay for those continues, so bosses were a little bit unfair back in the day. That sucks. I'm gonna have to continue. I still have a little bit more to say as we look at the awesome continue screen here. I think maybe I'll switch to Hager, though, so we can see some of his gameplay. Yeah, I must admit, I kind of like this game. It does suck that you have to begin from the beginning of the stage, though. I always thought that was cruel and unusual, but hey, here we are, as we see some slowdown with the train pulling in. Again, if this game had come out later on, the programmers probably would have done a better job. As we beat Katana there. I always love beating up this car. Pay close attention to what the guy says after I'm done beating up the car.
Oh my god.
You see in the text there, he says, "Oh my car," and the voice sample is cut off. And that's because in the arcade, the speech bubble and the voice sample said, "Oh my god." And that was just one other example of Nintendo's censorship back in the day. This game is considered heavily censored because for that, and also, as I said, the female characters were turned to male characters. Censorship in video games was a very big deal back then, uh, made more so when Mortal Kombat came out, and a whole storm of goofiness happened because of politicians who didn't understand what video games were and who were playing them. You know, up until the mid 90s, it was thought of that the only people who played video games were small children. And I know I'm in my 40s now, so I feel okay saying this, but adults can be so dumb sometimes. And that's still true to this day. People have a hard time accepting new things. And that's what video games were to a lot of people back then. Nowadays, it seems silly that female characters wouldn't be represented in games, wouldn't be the main characters of games. Why not? And then blood in video games was a no-no back then, but why wouldn't you show that? It's realistic. It's a video game. It's not real life. If you're concerned that somebody's going to emulate a video game, you need to get them mental health treatment because they've got bigger issues than what they're seeing in video games. This level is also censored, but I think more for system limitations than anything else. There used to be a bartender behind the bar in the arcade version. He's missing in the Super Nintendo version. But as I said before, the Super Nintendo can only fit so many characters on screen at a time. The characters are at least large, though, you gotta admit that. I do like what Sega did with Streets of Rage, and especially Streets of Rage 2, and they could put a lot of characters on screen, and proportionally they were pretty decently sized. But Final Fight, man, its beefy characters were just... They added some oomph to this game, they made it fun to play. And I think that's what Capcom got right with the design of Final Fight. I haven't said much about the music. This particular track here is nothing special, but I think some of the music in this game is just stands the test of time as well. When I get to the park stage, I'm definitely going to shut up and just kind of let that one shine a little bit because the music is sweet, especially the transition that happens near the bathroom area. I usually don't get savaged by these guys so bad. If I recall correctly, the best tactic is to use a weapon and just mash the button. That's what happens when you talk and play video games, though. I'm definitely the sort of person that if I'm talking while playing a video game, I'm going to not do as well. The same way when I'm driving, which is why I don't like to carry on conversations in the car. That was bad luck for me. I didn't expect that I was going to grab him. My original plan was to just jump out of the way. Oh well. We're having fun. One thing I'll give Nintendo, the Super Nintendo has a very unique sound capability. Some would refer to its music and audio as kind of shallow and muffled, but I don't know. I think the decisions they made to use the sound chip that they did resulted in very interesting takes on musical scores and voice samples, especially in role-playing games that just really stand up. I'm not a huge role-playing game fan, but I could listen to Final Fantasy III on the Super Nintendo all the time. And the Street Fighter 2 music, for example, as well. It's very different in some regards from the arcade, but those differences are, I think, positive. The music in the Super Nintendo version of Street Fighter 2 isn't better than the arcade or the Genesis version, but it's different, and that's cool. This boss here, you've got to try and stay close to him, or else he'll really give you a bad day. I could have picked up his gum, though. If you eat his already been chewed gum, it will heal you, which I'm going to do right now. Yeah, like I said, you want to stay close to him, but not so close that he whacks you in the head. And that's why you want to stay close to him, because he will shoot you. I'm probably not going to play through the whole game, but if I lose all my lives on this stage before I get to the bathroom section, I'm gonna continue because I think that sound transition is awesome. I just love that name, Bilbo and Wong Hu. These guys just don't stop, do they? Nice little bit of slowdown there with all the barrels on screen. Bad timing for me. The Andor characters would go on to be represented in the Street Fighter series as Hugo. I believe their name was supposed to be representative of the wrestler Andre the Giant. And the slowdown unfortunately made it impossible for me to do the inputs to break those barrels. That is one of the drawbacks of the Super Nintendo, is when the slowdown hits, often it makes it impossible to input commands. So I reaped none of the benefits of the barrels, which is sad, because there were health items in there. Alright, and through the magic of modern editing, I have come back from a continue to pick up where I left off. Generally, when you continue in this game, you have to start back at the beginning of the stage, but I didn't want to put y'all through that. It's interesting to think when they released this version, or this game for the Sega CD, even though they put Roxy and Poison back in the US version, they still edited them to wear clothing that was less revealing, and that carried through to the Game Boy Advance port as well. For whatever reason, video game companies just don't want to. Sorry, my pause there is because the music transition is happening and it's awesome. I think the horn section could be a little beefier in this song, but it's just a great transition. So as I was saying, I just think it's funny that the censorship would cover up and make the female characters less revealing, which in the one hand, yes, is more respectful, but that's not how the original subject matter was presented. You know, it's kind of like taking the more racist aspects out of Disney animated movies from the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. They're a product of their time, and I think they should be evaluated for that. I mean, do I think that those depictions are appropriate? Not necessarily, but if you ignore too much of history, you are doomed to repeat it. So, while I'm not exactly a guy who stands for a million Confederate monuments everywhere, I think when we start editing movies and video games and television, we kind of rest on a slippery slope there. If you've watched this video this far, I will say thank you for sticking with me. When I eventually post it online, it will be edited somewhat, but I know it's still going to be longer than a lot of people would want to sit through. I think while this game hasn't aged well from the perspective that there are better versions of Final Fight out there, and it lacks a two-player mode, in terms of being a first-run Super Nintendo game, it's actually it's impressive with what they did. They made a game that captured the spirit of the arcade game. That is still somewhat fun to play. It's by no means perfect, but it's certainly playable. It's certainly worth the 8 to 15 bucks it costs to get a copy of the game nowadays. Unless you want to be really crazy and spend hundreds of dollars on Final Fight Guy, which I would not recommend. I just love that I punched a knife out of the air. That's some Bruce Leroy type shit there. Which that reminds me, now's as good a time as any. If you have not seen the movie The Last Dragon, you owe it to yourself to watch that movie. It's great. Look up a Minty Comic Arts video on YouTube about The Last Dragon, and you'll see what I mean. And these knife guys, they just keep coming. Also, I don't know what El Gato means, but if he had been named El Gato, he would be the cat. So there's that. One thing I'll say about this game, even though it only puts 3 enemies on screen at a time, it definitely keeps those 3 ever present when it needs to. I used to enjoy the beat-em-up genre quite a lot. It's a genre that's definitely fell off. No longer really all that popular, although the recent release of Streets of Rage 4 has definitely shown that there can be life in it if somebody puts enough care and love into making their game. In this stage, once you can see the Statue of Liberty, you know that Abigail, the boss of the stage, is not far behind. He is probably going to kick my butt. That's okay, though. You'll see he just grabbed me right out of midair. I think I'm going to go ahead and end the video here. I think we've seen enough of Final Fight. I want to thank you for joining me. Yeah, there are better versions of Final Fight out there, but it's a game that's worth playing no matter how you play it. So with that, I'm out of here. Kaboom. See ya!